She knocked on the wall and heard nothing. Then she knocked again, and the wall knocked back. Not a silence. The specific silence of a space that has been holding something for a very long time. She was 26 years old, newly widowed, standing alone in a condemned farmhouse that her husband's family had handed her like a joke with a straight face. $200 in her account. A set of chisels on the passenger seat of her car. And now this. A hollow behind the library wall of a house that had been sealed shut for 22 years. She didn't reach for her phone. She didn't call anyone. She went to find a pry bar. Because somewhere in that wall, a woman she had never met had left something behind. Not for family, not for lawyers, for whoever came next and knew how to listen. She was about to find out what 22 years of silence had been keeping. She had 3 things when she pulled up to Ashford House for the first time. A set of wood chisels in a canvas roll on the passenger seat, $200 in her checking account, and a key that had been sitting in a brown paper envelope on the lawyer's desk for 20 minutes before anyone bothered to hand it to her. That was it. That was the whole inheritance. The house sat at the end of a gravel road outside Millhaven, Virginia, half hidden behind a row of loblolly pines that hadn't been trimmed since the 90s. 2 stories, gray wood siding gone the color of old ash, a porch that tilted 10 degrees to the left. 5 windows across the front, every one of them shut behind plywood boards that had warped and split in the weather. Clara sat in her car for a moment and looked at it, just looked. She was 26 years old. She had buried her husband 4 months ago, and the Reeves family, his family, the people who had tolerated her at Sunday dinners and spoken to her slowly, the way you speak to someone you're not entirely sure understands English. Those people had just handed her a condemned farmhouse that had been sitting empty since 1997, 22 years of rot. Which she thought was about right. She got out of the car, the gravel crunched. The pines moved in a way that wasn't quite wind, more like the whole tree line was exhaling. She stood in front of the house and held the key in her palm and let herself feel the full weight of how bad this was. Then she walked up the porch steps carefully, one hand on the rail that shifted under her weight, and put the key in the lock. It didn't turn. She tried again. Nothing. She tried a 3rd time and leaned her shoulder into the door, and the lock turned, and the door swung open into darkness that smelled like old wood and something dry and gone sweet, like the inside of a drawer that hadn't been opened in 2 decades, like everything that had been sealed in there had finally decided to come out. Clara stepped in. She was wearing the black dress she'd worn to the funeral, to the will reading, to 3 separate conversations with the family lawyer, in which no one had looked at her directly. The dress was too thin for October in the Shenandoah foothills. She hadn't gone home to change. She hadn't had anywhere to go. The entry hall was narrow and dark, pine floors under 20 years of dust. A staircase on the right with a newel post that had come loose at the base. To the left, a doorway into a sitting room where the wallpaper had peeled away from the corners and curled toward the floor like something trying to escape. She didn't go into the sitting room. She went straight through the hall and into the kitchen at the back of the house. The kitchen was big, bigger than she'd expected. A cast-iron range against the east wall, dull with old grease. A deep stone sink under a window that looked out onto what had been a kitchen garden, now entirely overtaken by goldenrod and something woody she couldn't name from here. A long wooden work table down the center, scarred and stained from what looked like decades of use. She ran her hand along the tabletop. Good wood. Oak, solid underneath all that grime. She knew this the way she'd known it since she was 7 years old, kneeling on a paint-spattered tarp in her father's workshop in Morgantown, watching him drag a hand plane across a board of rough-sawn walnut. He never explained what he was doing. He just did it and let her watch until she understood. And what she had understood for 19 years, without ever putting language to it, was that wood tells you what it is if you bother to listen. Not everyone listens. Most people look at a scratched-up oak table in a condemned farmhouse and see garbage. Clara looked at it and saw 20 more years. She pulled out a chair. It wobbled but held, and sat down at the kitchen table, in her funeral dress in the dark of Ashford House. Outside, the loblolly pines moved again. A board somewhere on the 2nd floor creaked, settling. The range ticked in the cold. She took the key out of her pocket and set it on the table. And she thought about the look on Diane Reeves's face when Mr. Lattimore had finished reading the relevant section of Dorothy Ashford's will. not surprise. Diane Reeves did not do surprise. It was something more controlled than that. A slight adjustment around the mouth, a micro-compression of the lips that in another woman might have been the beginning of a frown, but in Diane Reeves was simply the face of a person recalibrating. Then she'd said, without looking at Clara, James always did have his father's way with property. James's Aunt Philippa had laughed, a short, finished sound like a staple gun. James's cousin Russell had said nothing, which was somehow worse, and Clara had sat in her chair near the door. She had been placed near the door, she noticed, which she supposed made a kind of statement. And she had looked at her hands in her lap and thought, $200, a set of chisels, a house in Millhaven, okay. She had built her life out of less than that before. Because her father had a saying, not a clever saying, not the kind of thing you'd put on a sign, just something he used to mutter while he worked. You don't need much to start. You need to know what you're working with. She had picked up the brown envelope. She had thanked Mr. Lattimore. She had nodded at Diane Reeves in a way that communicated absolutely nothing. And then she had driven 2 hours south to Millhaven and turned down the gravel road and done this. She stayed at the kitchen table for a long time. The light outside went from gray to a deeper gray, and she learned the sounds of the house. The creak on the second floor wasn't a creak. Exactly, it was a sequence. 3 notes in the same order, which meant it was the same board flexing as the temperature dropped, and not something structural giving way. The drip from the kitchen sink had a rhythm she could set her breathing to. The pines outside made a sound like shushing. After a while she stood up. She found a flashlight in her car. She came back in and she walked the house the way her father had taught her to walk any structure she was thinking about working on. Slow, systematic, no assumptions. She went room by room on the ground floor. The sitting room, ceiling intact, no active water damage. The fireplace flue looked blocked but not collapsed. The dining room, a long table still in it, covered with a canvas drop cloth that had once been white. Under the cloth, the table was oak. She didn't lift the cloth all the way. She just felt along one leg and knew. She went into the library at the end of the hall. It was the best room in the house. 3 walls of bookshelves, floor to ceiling, in dark walnut that had held its color. A fireplace with a plain marble surround. 2 tall windows facing the overgrown garden, shuttered from the outside but not boarded. And a 4th wall, the inner wall, paneled in the same walnut as the shelves. She stood in the middle of the room and played her flashlight across the books. They were still there. Hundreds of them, leaning and dust-furred, but still there. Someone had cared about books. Someone had cared about this room. Dorothy Ashford. She thought about the woman whose house this had been. 63 years old when she died in 1997. A widow, no children. James had barely known her. She was private, was what he'd said, once, when Clara asked. She kept to herself. I think she was happier alone than most people are with company. Clara moved to the paneled inner wall. She raised her hand, old habit. She knocked. The first panel solid, a dull thud. Second panel solid. Third panel, something different, not a thud. A hollow resonance, a depth behind the wood that told her there was a space. She knocked again, the same sound. There was something behind that wall. She told herself to focus. There were 20 things in this house that needed attention before she could start looking for whatever was behind a wall in the library. The plumbing, the roof, the furnace, assuming there was one. She had $200 and a set of chisels. She noted the spot and went upstairs. She slept that night in what had been a small bedroom at the back of the 2nd floor, which was the only room with a bed still in it, a single iron bed with a horsehair mattress under a ticking striped cover that was dusty but intact. She had a wool blanket from her car. She was still in the black dress. She did not sleep much, but what sleep she got was without dreams, and she woke up in the dark before 5, with the particular clarity that comes not from rest, but from a mind that has already decided what it's going to do next. She started with the kitchen. For 2 days she worked alone. She cleared the range of 22 years of accumulated grease, burning through 2 boxes of steel wool and a can of degreaser she found under the sink. She tested the gas line. It had been shut off at the meter, not cut. She found the water main behind a panel in the utility room off the kitchen. And she turned it on and held her breath. And the pipes shook and clanged and ran rust brown for 3 minutes and then ran clear. She cleaned the kitchen windows. She swept the floors twice. She found a mop in the utility room and used it until the bucket water ran from black to gray. On the third day she drove into Millhaven for supplies. Hardware store first, then Garland's, which was the small grocery on the main street that appeared to have been there since approximately the Eisenhower administration. The woman behind the counter was 62, gray-haired, with the kind of direct gaze that either means she likes you immediately or doesn't intend to pretend she does. Her name, as the embroidered apron told Clara, was Ruthie. "You're the one out at the Ashford place," Ruthie said. Not a question. "Yes, ma'am." Ruthie looked at her for a moment, not just squarely. "You know how to work?" Clara said, "Yes, good." Ruthie handed her a can of coffee from the shelf behind her. "Then you'll be fine. Most people who come through that door and go out to that place want to know if it's worth anything. You asked me for steel wool and pipe compound." Clara paid for her supplies. At the door, Ruthie said, "Ed Sutton does structural. Used to do work out there when Dorothy was alive. He's at the end of Cutter Road. Tell him Ruthie sent you." She did. Ed Sutton was 58 and had the hands of a man who had been using them for hard work since he was 17. He opened the door in a canvas work shirt and looked at Clara for a moment, the way you look at weather coming in evaluating neutral, and then he said, "Let me get my boots." He walked through Ashford House the way she'd walked through it. Slow, quiet, checking the things you can only check by touch. He pressed the porch boards with his weight and felt which ones flexed. He opened the furnace room and put his flashlight on the ducts and read them without speaking. He went up on the roof and she watched from below while he moved carefully along the ridgeline. He came down. "Roof's got maybe 2 bad sections," he said. "West corner and above the library. Rest of it's sound. You catch it now, you can save it. Another winter, and you're talking about replacing. What does now cost?" He named a number. It was exactly the number she'd estimated based on the square footage and pitch she'd clocked from the ground, which meant either she was right or he was looking at the same math she was. She decided it was both. "I'll start Friday," he said. She did not ask him why he was willing to take the job on this kind of timeline, for a woman he'd never met, for a property that must have looked like a bad bet from the outside. She guessed there was a reason. There always was. She found it on the second Friday. Ed was coming in for coffee. She made a pot every morning now, and she set a mug on the kitchen table without asking. Because he arrived at 7, and always looked like he hadn't slept quite enough. And he sat down and looked at the windows she'd reglazed that week and said, "Dorothy used to do that. Reglaze the south windows every few years." Said they got the worst of the summer sun. Clara poured her own coffee and sat down across from him. "You knew her well?" "Well enough." He wrapped both hands around the mug. "She helped us out one time. 2009. My wife was sick, needed a surgery the insurance wouldn't cover. Dorothy loaned me what I needed." He paused. "She didn't put a number on it, didn't give me a repayment schedule. She just said, pay it when you can or pay it some other way. I don't keep that kind of ledger." Clara looked at her coffee. "She sounds like someone worth working for," she said. She was. He stood up, taking his mug. She was the kind of person who believed that what you do with your hands says more about you than what you say with your mouth. He looked at Clara over the rim of his mug. "I guess that's why I'm here." She started on the library that second week. She cleared the bookshelves one at a time, wiping each volume with a damp cloth and setting them in the light to air. She oiled the walnut shelves with a mix of linseed and turpentine that her father had used, working it into the wood with a soft rag in long strokes that went with the grain. The color came back like something waking up, dark and warm and alive in a way the library hadn't been when she first walked in. She was working along the inner wall, the paneled wall, when she found it again. She had been setting books back on the lower shelves, moving methodically left to right, and her knuckle caught the third panel and the sound came back to her. Hollow, resonant, a space. She stopped. She placed her palm flat on the panel and moved it slowly, the way you feel for something under a table you've knocked off. The hollow section was about 4 feet wide between 2 carved pilasters. She knocked along the edges and found where the sound changed, where the solid met the empty. She went to her toolbox in the kitchen and came back with a pry bar and a flashlight. She ran her fingers along the top molding. She was looking for the logic of it, because everything has logic. Every hidden thing was hidden by a person using the same physical constraints you're using now. And if you think about how you would have done it, you usually find it. A peg, most likely, flush with the grain, near the top where a hand would reach without straining. She found 3 of them. Oak pegs, driven tight, stained to match the surrounding wood. She worked the first one with the point of the pry bar until it gave. Then the second, then the third. The panel loosened in its frame. She lifted it out and set it against the shelves. Behind it was a shallow cupboard about 3 feet deep, lined in painted pine. The paint had yellowed but held, and in the cupboard on a low shelf were 3 things. A tin box, japanned black, the size of a large book, its lid tied down with a strip of cotton twill tape. A canvas bag, folded over at the top, heavy, and resting across both of them, a sealed envelope. Clara crouched down and looked at the 3 things without touching them. The flashlight made shadows. The house was very quiet around her. On the envelope, in handwriting she didn't recognize, neat and a little old-fashioned, forward slanting, were 3 words. For whoever comes. She had found this envelope before, in the locked drawer in Dorothy's office on her first night here. She'd picked it up, read those 3 words, and set it back down. She hadn't been ready then. She hadn't known enough about this place yet, hadn't earned the right to open something addressed to her future self. She picked it up now. She sat on the floor of the library with her back against the shelves and the flashlight propped against the tin box, and she broke the seal. There were 2 pages inside, written on the same cream-colored paper as the envelope, in the same forward slanting hand. The date at the top was August 1996. She read the first line, "My name is Dorothy Ashford, and I have lived in this house for 31 years. She read the rest of it slowly, once through. Then she went back to the beginning and read it again, because the first time through she'd been tracking what it said, and the second time she needed to understand what it meant. Dorothy Ashford had written the letter in the last year of her life. When she knew, though, she didn't say how she knew that she wasn't going to be in Mill Haven much longer. She wrote that she had no family she trusted with the house. She wrote that she had watched too many properties pass to people who wanted the money but not the thing itself. She wrote that she had decided to leave Ashford House to whoever the Reeves family found least valuable, on the principle that the Reeves family had never once been right about the value of something they couldn't sell. Clara stopped reading. She looked up at the ceiling, at the plaster that she had patched 2 days ago in the northeast corner, filling the crack with compound and feathering the edges so you'd have to know where to look. She kept reading. Dorothy had, in her years alone at the house, made an arrangement with 3 neighboring families: the Garfields to the north, the Tanner family to the east, and old Gil Weaver on the South Road, who had been using the unpaved track along the eastern property line to access their backfields for 30 years. It wasn't on any official map. It wasn't in any lease. It was just an understanding, the kind of understanding that holds in rural places as long as everyone is decent and nobody sends a lawyer. Dorothy had wanted to formalize it. She had drawn up an easement agreement in 1996. It was properly written, properly signed by her, and witnessed by Harlan Fitch, who had been county clerk for 17 years and knew exactly what he was doing. The agreement gave those 3 families permanent right-of-way along the east track in exchange for nominal consideration of $1 each, already paid. She had never filed it. She had gone to file it the first week of October 1996, and she had gotten sick on the way into town and driven herself home and gone to bed. And by the time she was well enough to go back, she had decided to put it here instead, in the cupboard, in case. She had also put in the canvas bag the silver she'd kept from her mother's estate, and in the tin box the cash she'd been setting aside for years. She wrote the amounts in the letter. She wrote that whoever found this should use it to care for the house. She wrote that the easement was more important than the silver and the cash combined, because the easement was a promise she had made to her neighbors and she didn't want to die having broken it. At the bottom of the second page she had written, "I don't know who you are, I don't know how you got here, but if you're reading this you found the wall, which means you know how to listen to a house. That's enough for me." Clara sat on the floor of the library for a long time after that. The flashlight started to dim. She didn't get up to find new batteries. She just sat with the letter in her hands and the tin box and the canvas bag and the canvas-covered easement document she had just found folded inside the envelope's second page, signed and witnessed, legal and real. 23 years old and still waiting. She thought about Harlan Fitch, whoever he was, whether he was still alive, whether he was still in Mill Haven, She thought about the Garfields and the Tanners and Gil Weaver. She thought about how Dorothy Ashford had decided that the Reeves family would give this house to whoever they thought least of. And she thought, you were right about that. She put the letter carefully back in its envelope. She opened the tin box and counted what was inside the way her father had taught her to count money twice, in order, without getting ahead of herself. She wrote the number in the small notebook she kept in her back pocket. She closed the box and tied the twill tape back the way she'd found it. She put the panel back in place. She replaced the pegs. She sat down in the library with the lights off and listened to the house settle around her for what must have been an hour. It was Ed who found her there, when he came in from the roof to tell her he was heading out for the night. He stood in the doorway and looked at her sitting on the floor with her back against the shelves. He didn't ask what had happened. He looked at the wall. He looked back at her. He said, "You found it." She said yes. He nodded once. Dorothy said it would be the right person or nobody. He picked up his jacket from the chair. "I'll be back at 7, and he left. Clara stayed until it was fully dark. Then she got up off the floor, and she went to the kitchen, and she stood at the stone sink and washed her hands in cold water for a long time. She looked out the window at the goldenrod in the old kitchen garden, blue-gray now in the dark. She had 3 things when she pulled up to Ashford House for the first time. She had considerably more than that now. The chisel roll was still on the passenger seat of her car, where she'd left it on the first day. She'd been going out to get it, every morning and bringing it in, and every evening she'd been taking it back to the car, because she didn't quite trust the locks yet. She went and got it now. She brought it inside. She put it on the kitchen table. She put the kettle on, and she sat down to figure out what came next, because there was an easement agreement in her library that belonged to 3 families who didn't know it existed, signed by a woman who'd been dead for 22 years, witnessed by a man named Harlan Fitch, whose address she did not have. And somewhere in Millhaven, or the county around it, there was a company that had its eye on the east track and the property line, and the thing Dorothy had been trying to protect. She didn't know that yet. Not exactly. But she felt it the way you feel a hollow wall before you knock on it. That particular silence. That sense of depth where there shouldn't be any. She poured her tea. The house settled again. 3 notes, the same board, the same sequence. She was starting to know the rhythms of it, starting to know which sounds meant something, and which ones were just the house breathing. She took out her notebook. She opened it to a clean page. She wrote at the top what needs to happen, what I have, what I don't have yet. She started to write. The first morning she used the cast iron range, she burned the coffee, not a little, completely. The kind of burned where the smell gets into the walls and stays there for 3 days. And every time you walk past the kitchen, you get a small reminder that you are still learning the house. And the house is not particularly interested in being easy about it. She stood at the range and looked at the black pot and thought, okay. She made a second pot. That one was fine. That was October. By November she had learned the range the way you learn a difficult person, not by fighting it but by paying attention. Low flame for the first 10 minutes. The left burner ran hotter than the right. The oven needed 20 extra degrees past whatever temperature you actually wanted. The house was teaching her things. She was teaching the house things back. Ed came every morning at 7. Clara had started having coffee ready by 6:50 because she had learned that Ed arrived exactly at 7. And that if the coffee wasn't poured, he would pour it himself, and somehow that felt like losing a small negotiation she hadn't known they were having. She set his mug on the table. He sat down. They drank coffee and talked about what needed doing that day in the specific economical language of 2 people who would rather be working than talking about working. He replaced the bad roof sections over 3 days. He rebuilt the porch rail. He rehung the front door so it closed flush. He found a cracked beam in the utility room ceiling and sistered it before it became a collapsed beam, which Clara recognized as exactly the kind of thing that makes the difference between a house that lasts and a house that doesn't. She paid him weekly, cash. He named a number that was fair but below what his labor was worth, and she paid him the full market rate, and he didn't argue about it, which told her he had expected her to. She was working in the workshop. She hadn't planned on a workshop. But the back room off the kitchen, not the utility room, the other one, the one with the exterior door and the south-facing window, and the wide pine floor had a workbench along one wall. with a vise still mounted on it and a row of hooks above it where tools had once hung and left their ghost outlines in the dust. A plane-shaped shadow, a saw-shaped shadow, a hammer that was still there hanging from the last hook, as though Dorothy had put it down for a minute and forgotten to come back. Clara oiled it. She hung her own tools on the empty hooks, and she started taking in work. It began with Ruthie Garland, who mentioned to Clara one November morning that she had a chest of drawers that had belonged to her mother, and that a leg had cracked at the joint, and that the furniture repair shop in Staunton had quoted her $250, which Ruthie felt was what you paid for a chest of drawers, not what you paid to fix one. Clara looked at the chest when Ruthie brought it by in her truck. Quarter-sawn white oak, dovetailed corners, probably 80 years old. The cracked leg was a clean break at the mortise, which was about 2 hours of work if you had the right clamps and the right glue and knew what you were doing. $40, Clara said. I'll need it for 2 days. Ruthie looked at her, then at the chest, then back at her. Done, she said. Word got around the way word gets around in small towns. Not fast, not loud, just steadily the way water finds its level. By December, Clara had a waiting list of 3. By January, it was 7. Chairs, mostly. Then a dining table with a warped top that Clara flattened with a hand plane over the course of an afternoon, working with the grain until it was true. A roll-top desk that had seized up at the mechanism and which she disassembled entirely, cleaned, and reassembled over the course of a week, charging $60 for what had taken 4 hours of actual work, and 3 of puzzling out how the mechanism was supposed to function. She was not getting rich, but she was eating. She was paying Ed. She was building something. The easement document lived in a fireproof box she'd bought at the hardware store in Millhaven and kept in the library on the shelf behind the complete works of Thomas Hardy. She had told no one about it except Ed, who already knew and who had said nothing further about it since the night she'd found it. She had found Harlan Fitch. He was in the phone book, the actual phone book, the county one from 2018 that was sitting in the utility room. When she moved in, already 2 years out of date, but still reasonably accurate for a man of 71 who had lived at the same address on Perch Run Road for 34 years. She hadn't called him yet. She wasn't sure why, or she was sure and didn't want to say it out loud even to herself. The easement was safe in the fireproof box. The 3 families were still using the track, which she had walked one morning in January, following it from the eastern property line through the gap in the tree row and out into the Garfield family's back field where the winter cover crop had gone silver in the frost. Nobody had bothered them yet, and she wasn't ready. She knew what the easement meant. She knew what filing it meant. It meant announcing herself. It meant becoming someone with a legal stake in something that other people had economic reasons to want. It meant stepping out from behind the work, the quiet, careful, satisfying work of hands and wood, and a house that was becoming real and into something larger and colder and more adversarial. She was good at the work. She wasn't sure yet what she was at the rest of it, so she waited, she worked, she learned the house. February brought snow, and then more snow, and then a week of ice that took down a section of fence along the north pasture and made the gravel drive impassable for 3 days, during which Clara stayed inside, drank more coffee than was medically advisable, and finished restoring a Windsor chair that had been missing 2 spindles. She turned the replacement spindles herself on a lathe she'd found under a canvas in the corner of the workshop. Dorothy's lathe, still sound. She ran her hand along it the first time the same way she'd run her hand along everything in this house. Good, solid, worth keeping. She thought about Dorothy a lot in those winter months, not with grief she hadn't known her, more with a kind of lateral awareness. A sense of a presence that had shaped the rooms she was moving through, the depth of the bookshelves, which were exactly the right height for reaching the top row, without a stool if you were about Clara's height. The workbench in the workshop, set at a height that would have been too tall for a man of average build, but was exactly right for a woman who stood 5'8". The hooks for the tools, placed with a logic that Clara understood without having to decipher it. Dorothy Ashford had lived alone and worked with her hands and had organized her space for herself. Not for a husband, not for guests, for her own body and her own habits. Clara found this more companionable than she would have expected. March. The snow let off. The goldenrod in the kitchen garden was still brown and bent, but under it, where she'd cleared a strip along the south fence, Something green was coming up. She didn't know what it was. She left it alone and watched. It was Ed who told her about Preston Cole. He didn't tell her on purpose. He mentioned it the way you mention something you think the other person already knows, which is how you find out how much they don't know. He came in one morning in late March, later than usual, and sat down at the kitchen table and didn't pick up his coffee immediately, which was unusual. Ed always picked up his coffee immediately. Clara said, "What?" Not a question. She'd learned enough about Ed to know when the inflection didn't need to go up. He said, "There was a survey crew on the East Line this morning." She was still. "What kind of survey crew?" "Private, not county. They had a truck with a company name I didn't recognize." He picked up his coffee. I asked them what they were doing. They said routine property assessment. Nobody does routine property assessment on a private residential line in March. "No," he said, "they don't." She sat down. The East Line, the track, the Garfields, the Tanners, Gil Weaver, the easement in the fireproof box behind Thomas Hardy. How long were they out there? About 40 minutes. They were gone before 8, she said. "Okay. Then did you get the company name?" He had written it on the back of a gas station receipt. He put it on the table. She looked at it. Reeves Land Holdings LLC, incorporated in Virginia. Registered agent, a law firm in Charlottesville. She read the name twice. Reeves, not James's branch of the family. But the Reeves family was not small. James's father had a brother, Walter, who had spent 30 years building a real estate operation that James had referred to exactly once as a thing I try not to think about very much. She had not asked follow-up questions at the time, because James had said it in the tone you use when you want a topic to close. She thought about that now. She thought about Diane Reeves sitting across from her in the lawyer's office, adjusting slightly, recalibrating, saying, "James always did have his father's way with property." She thought, they know what's here, or they think they do, or they're figuring it out, or they already figured it out and this is the opening move. She was not a legal person. She did not know how these things worked exactly, but she knew the shape of it. She knew that if someone wanted the East Track, if someone wanted to develop anything east of her property line that would require breaking that informal 30-year arrangement, they would need to establish that no formal easement existed, and if no easement had been filed, and the woman who'd drawn one up was 22 years dead, and the woman who'd inherited the house had been handed it as an afterthought, well, you could see why someone might think the timing was convenient. She picked up her notebook. She looked at Ed. "I need Harlan Fitch's address. You already have it. I know. I need a reason to go use it." He looked at her steadily. "I think you just got one." She went that afternoon. Harlan Fitch lived in a white farmhouse at the end of Perch Run Road, which was exactly as far from Millhaven Center as you could get while still technically being in the county. He answered the door in a flannel shirt and reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, and he looked at Clara for a moment and said, "You're from the Ashford place?" "Yes, sir. Come in." He walked with a cane. Not heavily, he used it like punctuation rather than support, tapping it occasionally as if to mark a point. He led her into a kitchen that smelled like coffee and sawdust, which meant he still worked with his hands, which meant she liked him immediately. She put the easement document on his kitchen table. He sat down and picked it up without hurry, and read it the way you read something you've read before, not for information, but to confirm that what you remember is what's there. He turned to the signature page. He looked at his own signature for a long moment. Then he looked at her. "She kept it," he said. "She kept everything," Clara said. "She just didn't file it." "I know. I expected her to file it that fall. When she didn't come back, I called the house a few times. No one answered." He set the document down with care. "By the time I understood what had happened, the estate had already been tied up for months, and then it went quiet. I thought maybe she'd filed it before she got sick. I didn't think to check." He looked at the document again. "It's valid," he said. "I'll tell you that right now. Properly drawn, properly witnessed, consideration exchanged. The only reason it's not in the county records is because nobody walked it through the door." He tapped his cane once on the floor. "Which is a situation we can fix." Clara looked at him. "There's a survey crew from Reeves Land Holdings that was on my East Line this morning," she said. He went very still. "Walter Reeves," he said. "I think so." He was quiet for a moment. "Then he's been trying to get at that east corridor for 15 years. There's an agricultural parcel behind the Garfield property been in family for 3 generations, and if you can consolidate access through that track, it becomes developable. Strip mall, storage facility." He's had his eye on it since before Dorothy died. Clara said, Dorothy knew. Dorothy knew everything. That's why she drew this up. He looked at the document, then back at her. Does anyone else know you have it? Just the man who works for me. Then you need to file it, he said. And you need to file it before someone figures out you know it exists. Because right now they're doing assessment. That's reconnaissance. The next step is paperwork. She drove back to Millhaven. She thought on the drive about James, about a particular Sunday dinner, early in their marriage, at the Reeves house in Charlottesville. Walter Reeves had been there. He was a large man who filled a room, the way furniture fills a room. You arrange yourself around him without quite deciding to. He had shaken Clara's hand and looked at her with the calm, evaluating attention of a man who was always pricing things. And then he had turned to talk to someone else. And she had understood that she had been assessed and found unremarkable, which at the time had felt like a relief. It did not feel like a relief now. She got home. She went into the library. She took the easement out of the fireproof box behind Thomas Hardy, and she sat at the long table and read it again all the way through, checking every clause. Dorothy had been careful. The language was plain and clear. Right-of-way in perpetuity along the East Track, 12 feet wide, for agricultural and residential access. Consideration of $1 from each family, paid and received, signed by Dorothy Ashford in August 1996. Witnessed by Harlan Fitch, county clerk. She set it down. She sat for a while with just the document and the quiet. Ed knocked on the library door, and she said, "Come in," and he came in and stood in the doorway and looked at her sitting at the table. She said, "Harlan says it's valid and needs to be filed before they figure out we have it." Ed said, "When?" "As soon as I can get to the county office, I'll drive you." She looked at him. "You don't have to do that." He said Dorothy didn't have anybody with her when she tried to go. He said it simply, not dramatically, just as a fact. "I think somebody should be with you." She didn't answer right away. She looked at the document, then at the window. The late March light was coming in sideways through the library windows, falling across the floor in long strips, warm in a way that felt slightly unearned for the time of year, like the season was trying something it wasn't sure it could pull off yet. She said, "Okay." The next morning she put on a dark green wool dress, the nicest thing she owned, and her good boots, and she pulled her hair back, and she drove to the county administrative office, in the county seat with Ed in the passenger seat and the easement document in a manila envelope on the back seat, and Harlan Fitch's signed letter of witness confirmation in a second envelope clipped to the first. The woman behind the counter at the county records office was named Doreen, according to her nameplate. She was 54, and looked at the document with the careful, slightly suspicious attention of a person who processes a lot of paperwork and can tell when something is unusual. She read it through. She looked at Clara. "This is dated 1996, she said. "Yes, it was never filed." "No, the owner died before she could bring it in." Doreen read it again. She picked up the letter from Harlan Fitch and read that too. "I'll need to run this by the county attorney," she said. "How long does that take?" "Normally, 2 to 3 weeks. Clara said, "I have reason to believe there may be a competing claim on that property line in development. I'm asking if there's a process for expedited review." Doreen looked at her over the document. "There is," she said. "You'd need to file a priority notice along with a sworn statement of interest and the original document. The fee is $45. I have $45. She filed it that morning. All of it. The easement. The priority notice. The sworn statement that Harlan had helped her draft at his kitchen table the night before, in plain language that said exactly what it needed to say and nothing else. She walked out of the county office into the March air. Ed was leaning against the truck, hands in his pockets. She said, "It's filed." He said, "Good." They drove back. She was quiet for most of the drive. Ed didn't push. He never pushed. She'd noticed this about him from the first week, that he understood the value of sitting alongside a thing without narrating it. About 20 minutes out from Millhaven, she said, "They're going to find out." "Yes," he said. "And then someone is going to show up, probably." She looked out the window. The fields were the pale gold brown of early spring, and the sky was doing that thing it did in the valley in March, where it couldn't decide if it was winter or not, and kept switching back and forth every 20 minutes. She said, "Good thing I know what I'm working with." He glanced at her, a small glance, the corner of a smile. Neither of them said anything else. She pulled into the Ashford house drive and parked. The pines moved. The porch was straight now. The windows held the light without shivering. She sat in the driver's seat for a moment before getting out. She had been in this house for 5 months. She had learned the range and the roof and the sound of the settling board on the second floor. She had restored 11 pieces of furniture and fixed 3 chairs and turned 12 new spindles on Dorothy's lathe. She had made coffee every morning and drunk it at the kitchen table, and learned which sounds were the house breathing, and which ones meant something needed attention. She had found the wall. She had found what was in it. And now she had put the piece of paper where it needed to be, 23 years late, on behalf of a woman she had never met who had trusted her with it. But that was the morning. The afternoon was when Preston Cole knocked on her door. She was in the workshop when she heard the knock. Measured, not loud. The knock of someone who had decided on exactly the right amount of force and was using it. She put down the plane she was holding. She wiped her hands on her work apron. She went to the front door. He was 44. Gray suit, no tie. The kind of suit that costs more than it looks like it costs, which is a thing that only happens when someone has made a choice about it. He had a leather portfolio under one arm and the expression of someone who had walked up to a lot of doors and was very calm about it. "Ms. Whitmore Reeves," he said. "My name is Preston Cole. I represent Reeves Land Holdings. Do you have a few minutes?" She looked at him. She thought, here we go. She said, "Come in." She didn't take him to the kitchen, she took him to the library. Because the library was where she thought clearly. And because she wanted him to see the bookshelves and the walnut paneling and the fireplace with the good marble surround, and because she wanted him in a room that had weight and history, and did not belong to anyone named Reeves. She sat across the table from him. He opened his portfolio. He was practiced at this, pleasant. He talked about the area and the development climate, and the potential of the county corridor. And he talked about how Reeves Land Holdings had been working in this region for a long time, and valued good relationships with neighboring landowners. And he talked about all of this in a voice that was warm and reasonable, and entirely without pressure. And then he put a number on the table. $280,000. For the east section of the property. Just the east section. The house and the main acreage would stay hers. She looked at the number. She looked at him. He said, "I want to be straightforward with you. The east section is primarily interesting to us because of the access it provides to the parcels beyond. We're not trying to acquire the house." He paused. "And I should mention there may be a question about the property line on the east side. A procedural matter from the original deed filing. I'd hate for that to become a problem for you down the road." There it was. She had been waiting for it, and when it came, it sounded exactly like she'd thought it would. Polite. Regretful. A problem she hadn't created but would need to navigate. The suggestion that she was in a precarious position, and that accepting the $280,000 was the sensible way to stop being precarious. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Mr. Cole, who specifically are you representing?" "Reeves Land Holdings, LLC. "And who controls Reeves Land Holdings?" A pause, small. "The principal is Walter Reeves. Walter Reeves is the brother of my late husband's father." Cole was still, she continued. "Which means you came to the house of your client's nephew's widow, 4 months after the funeral, to offer her less than market value for a piece of her inherited property, by way of suggesting that her title might have a problem." She let that sit for a moment. "That's an interesting approach." He adjusted slightly. "Just slightly," he said. "I understand this may feel personal. I assure you it's—" "I filed the Dorothy Ashford easement this morning," she said, "at the county office. Priority notice, sworn statement of interest, and original document with original witness confirmation." She folded her hands on the table. "The East Track has a permanent right-of-way attached to it in favor of 3 neighboring families. That right-of-way was legally established in 1996, which means the access your client wants to consolidate through my property for development of the parcels to the east is not available." Cole was very still. She said, "That's the procedural matter I'd hate to have become a problem." He looked at his portfolio. He looked back at her. He said, "I see," she said. "I'll show you out." She did. She walked him to the front door. She opened it. He went through it and down the porch steps steady, straight, not rushing, because he was a professional, and professionals don't rush. And he walked to his car and he got in and he drove away. She stood on the porch and watched until the car turned off the gravel drive onto the road. Then she went inside. She went to the kitchen and put the kettle on. She stood at the stone sink and looked out at the kitchen garden. The green thing she'd been watching for 3 weeks had resolved itself into a row of daffodil shoots, 6 inches tall now, coming up in the strip she'd cleared along the south fence. Dorothy's daffodils. Still coming up, 22 years later. Still there. She got down 2 mugs. Ed knocked once at the back door and came in, the way he did at the end of the day, and she poured without asking because she'd learned his schedule the way she'd learned the range. Low flame, west side, 20 extra degrees. He looked at her face. Someone came. Someone came, she said. And, she said, we'll see what happens next. She put the mug on the table for him. She sat down with her own. Outside the window, the daffodil shoots moved in a small cold wind, bending and recovering, bending and recovering. The house was warm. The coffee was the right temperature. She had work in the morning, and somewhere in a county office, on the other side of the valley, in a manila envelope, there was a piece of paper with Dorothy Ashford's signature on it, filed and dated and logged, doing exactly what it had always meant to do. 23 years late, right on time. 3 days after Preston Cole drove away, Diane Reeves called. Not a visit, a phone call, which told Clara something right away, because Diane Reeves was a woman who showed up in person when she wanted to control a room. A phone call meant she was not sure she could control this one. Clara was in the workshop, sandwiching a chair seat when her phone buzzed on the bench. She looked at the name on the screen, set down the sandpaper, picked up. Diane. Clara. A pause with weight in it. I imagine you know why I'm calling. I have a guess. Preston Cole works for Walter. Not for the company. For Walter personally. She said it the way you say something you've been deciding whether to say for 3 days. I'm not calling to defend what he did. I'm calling because if this goes to county proceedings and the Reeves name gets attached to a dispute over a widow's property line, I need you to understand that I had no part in it. Clara looked out the workshop window. The daffodil shoots in the kitchen garden were taller than yesterday. What do you want, Diane? A beat. I want to know what you're planning to do. I filed the easement. I'm going to let the county process work, and if Walter contests it, then I'll be there when they hear it. Silence on the line. Long enough that Clara checked the screen to make sure the call hadn't dropped. Then Diane said, in a voice slightly different from her usual voice, lower, less organized, Walter has been trying to get at that corridor since before Dorothy died. I didn't know about it until after James. A pause. I want you to know that. Clara stood with the phone and thought about the Sunday dinners, the chair near the door at the will reading, the envelope handed over while Philippa laughed. She thought about what she wanted to say. There was a version that was short and final. There was a version she'd been rehearsing for months alone, the kind of rehearsal that happens in the dark at 5 in the morning when your mind won't stop running the tape. She said neither of those. She said, I'm not going to pretend the last year didn't happen. But I'm not letting it be the only thing between us either. A long pause. Diane said, that's more than I deserve. Clara said, I know. She hung up. She stood in the workshop for a moment. Then she picked up the sandpaper and went back to the chair. The county attorney's office sent a letter 10 days later. Formal language, long sentences, the kind of writing that uses 7 words where one would do. But what it said, stripped down, was this. The easement filed by Clara Whitmore Reeves appeared to meet all requirements for validity, and a formal hearing had been scheduled to confirm the filing and address any outstanding questions. 2 weeks out, which meant Walter Reeves had 2 weeks to mount a challenge. Clara taped the letter to the refrigerator and looked at it every morning when she poured her coffee. She did not know if this was productive. It felt like the right thing to do with something you can't control, but refuse to lose sight of. Ed read it the morning she put it up. Said 2 weeks, she said, 2 weeks. He poured his coffee and sat down. We should talk to the Garfields. I was thinking the same thing, and the Tanners, and Gil Weaver if he's well enough. Gil's 83. I'll go to him myself. She went the next morning. The Garfields first because they were closest. Tom Garfield met her at his gate the way you meet someone you've been half expecting. And he read the easement at his kitchen table, while his wife June stood at the counter and didn't leave the room. When he finished, he set it down and looked at Clara. Dorothy told me she was going to do this, he said. I didn't know if she'd gotten to it. She got to it. She just didn't file it. If Reeves consolidates that corridor, we lose access to the back 30 acres. He said it flat. Not for sympathy, just so it was on the table. That's our best bottomland, I know. He looked at her. We'll be there. The tanner said yes before she finished explaining. The youngest tanner daughter, Rosie, who was 32 and ran the farm books, asked 3 sharp questions about legal standing. Clara answered 2 of them and said she'd check on the 3rd. Rosie wrote something in a notebook and nodded once, which Clara was already learning meant the matter was settled. Gil Weaver was 83 and came to the door in overalls and looked at Clara and said, "You're from the Ashford place?" "Yes, sir." "Dorothy's house?" "Yes, sir." He looked at her for a moment the way old men sometimes look at things they've been waiting to see. Then he said, "Come in, I'll make coffee." He made bad coffee. She drank it without comment. He read the easement the way Harlan had read it, like a man confirming what he remembered. He put his finger next to Dorothy's name on the signature page and held it there for a moment. "She was a careful woman," he said. "Yes, sir. I always wondered if she'd gotten it filed before she went." He set it down on his kitchen table, which was covered in seed catalogs and a county agricultural bulletin and a coffee ring that had been there long enough to look structural. "I should have called to check, but she was private and I respected that and maybe I shouldn't have," Clara said. She found a way. Gil looked at her, then at the document, then back at her. "She did," he said. "Took her a while." A pause. "But here it is." She drove home on roads she was starting to know by feel. The long curve before the Garfield property, the dip at the drainage ditch, the place where the valley opened up and you could see the ridge line all the way west. She thought about Dorothy, the way she'd been thinking about her since October. Not with grief, with something more like alignment. The sense of standing in a long line of women who had done careful work in quiet rooms and trusted that the work would hold. The hearing was on a Thursday morning in the county administrative building, a 1970s brick structure, with fluorescent lights and long tables and padded chairs that had been leaking stuffing since approximately 1994. Clara arrived 20 minutes early, dark green wool dress, good boots, hair pulled back, a manila folder with the original easement, Harlan's letter, and 3 copies of everything, made at the Millhaven Public Library for 40 cents a page. Ed was with her. Harlan came with his cane. Tom and June Garfield sat behind them. Rosie Tanner arrived exactly on time in a barn coat with her notebook. Gil Weaver had wanted to come, and Clara had said it wasn't necessary and he had come anyway, driven by his neighbor. And he sat in the 2nd row with his hands folded in his lap, looking like a man who had attended a lot of meetings and was not impressed by any of them. Preston Cole came in with a younger man Clara didn't recognize. They sat on the other side of the room. Cole had his briefcase and his gray suit and the same expression of professional calm he'd had at her kitchen table. The hearing officer was Patricia Dowd, Deputy Records Administrator for 16 years, who looked at the room over her reading glasses with the neutral attention of someone who processes a lot of property disputes and does not take sides until she has read every document in front of her. She read every document in front of her. 20 minutes, quiet room. The fluorescent light above Clara's table had a small flicker that nobody had gotten around to fixing. Patricia Dowd set down the last page. "Mr. Fitch," she said, "you witnessed this document in August of 1996. Harlan said, "I did. You can confirm the signature of Dorothy Ashford is genuine. I watched her sign it. I signed immediately after." He paused. "I was county clerk for 17 years. I know what a valid easement looks like." Patricia Dowd looked at him, then at Cole. "Mr. Cole, your client's position is that this easement is invalid due to the failure to file. Is that correct?" Cole said. "Our position is that an unfiled easement cannot be enforced against a subsequent purchaser or developer without actual notice. The delay of 23 years in presenting this document raises questions about." "There has been no subsequent purchaser," Patricia Dowd said. "The property passed by inheritance to Ms. Whitmore Reeves, who filed the document within 5 months of taking possession. The question of notice to a third party does not arise until there is a third party with an interest, which requires a transaction that has not occurred." She looked at him over her reading glasses. "Is there another basis for your challenge?" Cole opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. The procedural irregularity of the original. The document was properly drafted, properly signed, properly witnessed by the sitting county clerk. The only step not completed was filing, which has now been completed. She let that sit for a moment. "Is this a basis for your challenge, Mr. Cole, or are you raising a concern about timing?" Cole said, "We may wish to seek further review." Patricia Dowd said, "That is your client's right." In the meantime, the easement filed by Ms. Whitmore Reeves is accepted into the county record as of the filing date, with original execution date confirmed as August 1996. She looked at Clara. The right-of-way along the east track of Ashford House property is confirmed in favor of the Garfield, Tanner, and Weaver families in perpetuity. A pause. "Is there anything further, Ms. Whitmore Reeves?" Clara said, "No, ma'am, then we're done." Cole did not look at Clara when he left. He walked to the door with the same professional calm he'd walked in with, which she respected on a craft level, even as she understood it had been built to cover a situation that had gone the wrong way. Harlan stood slowly, and she offered him her arm, and he took it without comment. Tom Garfield shook her hand. June hugged her briefly, which Clara hadn't expected, and she stood in the hug for a moment, and then just hugged back, because sometimes that's the right response, and there's no point overthinking it. Rosie Tanner said, "Dorothy would have liked you." Clara said, "I didn't know her." "I know," Rosie said. "That's not what I meant." Gil Weaver was the last to reach her. He moved slowly and got there. He looked at her with those clear eyes and said, "You did right by her," she said. "She did most of it. I just walked it through the door," he said. "Sometimes that's the whole job." She drove home alone. Ed had offered to ride with her, and she'd said she needed the drive, and he'd said okay, which was the right answer. She went back through the county roads she was coming to know. The long curve, the dip, the ridgeline opening west, the same roads she'd driven 10 days ago to find 3 families who were still using a track that a woman 22 years dead had promised to protect. She thought about the hearing room. Patricia Dowd's voice saying confirmed into the county record. Harlan's 4 words, "I was there." Cole sitting still with nothing left to say. She pulled into the Ashford House drive and parked. The pines moved, the porch was straight, the south windows held the light without shivering. She sat in the car for a moment before getting out. Then she went in through the back. She did not put the kettle on. She went straight through the kitchen and down the hall and into the library. She stood in the middle of the room. The walnut shelves had the deep, warm color of wood that's been properly cared for. The estate map hung on the inner wall above the panel she'd opened and replaced in October. The fire was laid but unlit. The long table was clear. She went to the shelf, moved Thomas Hardy Volume 3, took out the fireproof box. She set it on the table and opened it. The tin box was there, still tied with twill tape exactly as she'd left it. The canvas bag, Harlan's copy of the witness confirmation. And behind those, flat against the back of the box, the second envelope. She had found this one in the days after she found the first. It had been pinned to the back of the estate map that Dorothy had left in the cupboard, and she had seen it immediately, and she had put it in the fireproof box without opening it. She had told no one about it, not Ed, not Harlan, because she had known, in the way you know things before you can explain them, that this one needed to wait, that there was a right moment for it, and that the right moment was not October, was not the morning Cole had knocked on her door, was not any of the days in between when she had been building the case and filing the papers and doing the work. The right moment was now. She sat down at the long table in the chair she'd been using since October, the one with the turned back that she'd re-glued in January when one of the stretchers had come loose. She picked up the envelope, the same cream paper as the first, the same forward slanting hand. Her name was not on this one, nothing was on it, just the seal. She broke it. 1 page. The date at the top was September 1996, a month after the first letter. She read it slowly. Dorothy had not written it as a legal document or an instruction. She had written it the way you write something, not because anyone asked you to, but because you wanted to exist outside your own memory. Because some things are too important to trust only to yourself. "James Reeves called me on a Tuesday morning in July," Dorothy had written. "He called because he wanted me to know he had gotten married. He was not a man who called often. He and I understood each other that way, but he called that morning, and he described his wife the way that young men describe a person they have just understood they are in love with, which is to say he described her entirely in terms of what she could do. He said she had grown up in her father's workshop. He said she could identify wood by the smell of the sawdust. He said she had held a cracked chair leg for 30 seconds and told him exactly what had broken and why, and what was needed to fix it. He said, "She reads wood the way her father taught her." Clara stopped. She looked up at the ceiling of the library. At the plaster she had patched in the northeast corner in November, filling the crack and feathering the edges so you'd have to know where to look. She looked back down. I don't know her, Dorothy had written. I don't know if I will ever know her. I am 62 years old and my hip gives me trouble and I have not been to Charlottesville in 4 years. I may not get there again. But I know something about that kind of reading. I know what it means to come into a room that other people have given up on and see what's worth keeping in it. I know what it costs, and I know what it gives back. I have been doing it in this house for 31 years and I am not sorry about any of it. I have been trying for a year to decide what to do with this house when I am gone. The Reeves family will not understand it. They have never understood it. Walter has been trying to buy the East Corridor for longer than he's admitted to anyone, and the rest of them would sell it without knowing what they were selling. I think maybe she would understand it. This is not a legal document. I have written the legal documents already, and they are in the cupboard behind the library wall, where someone patient will find them. This is just what I wanted to say. I hope she finds it. Dorothy Ashford, September 1996. Clara sat with the letter in her hands for a long time. The light in the library went from afternoon to early evening without her noticing. The fire was still unlit. The bookshelves around her had gone the deep reddish-brown that walnut goes in low light, which was one of the things she had come to love about this room. The way it changed its character with the hour. She read the last line again. I hope she finds it. She thought about James in a hotel room in July, calling a great aunt he rarely called to say, I got married. I want you to know. Here is who she is. He had described her in the only terms that would have mattered to Dorothy Ashford. He had not known that. He had just told the truth about her, and Dorothy had written it down and put it in a wall and trusted it to last. She thought about her father's workshop, the smell of it, resin and oil and the particular sweetness of fresh sawdust that collected in the corners no matter how often he swept. She had spent most of her childhood on the floor of that shop. Not because he asked her to, but because that was where the interesting things happened. Where the rough thing became the true thing. Where patience and the right angle produced something that would outlast the effort of making it. She had never thought of it as an inheritance. He was her father. You don't think of your father's habits as something he's giving you while he's still alive and still working. But she had it. She knew she had it. And Dorothy Ashford had known it too. From a description she had never been told was made, by a man who hadn't calculated what he was doing when he picked up the phone. She reads wood the way her father taught her. Which was the truest thing anyone had ever said about her, which had been written down in September 1996, and kept in a wall for 23 years, and was now in her hands in the library of the house that had been waiting for her. She did not cry. She sat with the letter and the quiet and the low light and let the room be what it was. What she felt was not simple enough to name. It was somewhere in the range of being seen accurately by someone who owed her nothing and had chosen to see her anyway. Not the Clara who sat near the door at the will reading. Not the Clara who had $200 and a set of chisels. The real one. The one who knew how to listen to a house. That one. Dorothy had known that one. After a while she folded the letter carefully and put it back in its envelope. She put the envelope back in the fireproof box. She closed the box and replaced it on the shelf behind Thomas Hardy, Volume 3. She went to the workshop, not for any specific reason, or not a reason she could have explained. Just that the workshop was where she went when she needed her hands to do something while her mind finished what it was doing. She untied her good boots and put on her work boots. She took off the dark green wool dress and hung it on the hook behind the door and put on her work clothes. She tied her apron. The chisel roll was on the bench. She unrolled it and looked at the tools her father had given her, one by one the way she sometimes did, not checking them, just looking. The handles worn smooth at the grip, the edges she kept sharp, because a dull chisel is more dangerous than a sharp one, which was one of the first things he'd taught her. She picked up a cabinet scraper and went to the chair she'd been working on before the hearing, a slat-back rocker, the kind that had been made in this region since the 18th century, with a seat that had been re-rushed badly at some point and then left alone for long enough that the rush had gone brittle and was crumbling off in pieces. She had stripped it down to the frame last week. The frame was sound. White oak, the old growth kind that doesn't exist anymore, tight-grained and dense and the color of good cream. She ran the scraper along one of the back slats. The sound it made was clean. That particular clean note that means the wood is true and the tool is right, and you are doing this correctly. She worked for a while in the quiet. The workshop had the last of the light. The south window was where Dorothy had put it, exactly where you would put it, if you worked with your hands and knew what you needed. The workbench was at the right height. The workbench was at the right height. The hooks above it held her tools in the order she'd arranged them, which was her father's order, which she had never thought about until she'd hung them up here, and realized she'd done it without thinking. She was halfway through the second slat when she noticed the thimble. Not her thimble, Dorothy's. She had found it in the tin box that first night in October, tucked into the corner under the rolls of cash. A silver thimble on a length of green ribbon, worn from use. The kind of object that meant something specific to the person who had kept it. She had set it aside carefully and not been sure what to do with it, and eventually she had hung it on the last hook above the workbench, the hook that had been empty when she arrived, the one with no ghost outline in the dust above it, Dorothy's hook. She had put the thimble there in November, and had been looking at it every day since, and had never said anything about it to anyone because she didn't have language for what it was. Not an heirloom. Not a keepsake. Something more functional than either. A marker, a record. This person was here. This person worked here. This person left something on the hook when she put down her work for the last time. Clara looked at it now in the last of the workshop light. The ribbon had gone soft with age, the green almost gray. The thimble itself still caught the light when the angle was right. She thought, Dorothy had kept this from someone too. Someone had given it to her the way her father had given Clara the chisels. And she had worked with it and kept it and in the end left it on the hook, which was, Clara thought, what you did with the things that mattered. You used them. You kept them. And when it was time, you trusted them to the next person who would know what they were. She went back to the chair. She worked until the light was fully gone, and she had to turn on the workshop lamp, and then she worked a while longer, because the chair was at the point where you could feel it coming true, under your hands. And you didn't want to stop when you were that close. Ed knocked at the back door just before 7, and she heard him come into the kitchen. The familiar sounds of it, the kettle on the left burner, the cabinet where the mugs were. She had not told him she was in the workshop. He found her anyway, because after 6 months he knew where she would be. He came to the workshop doorway with 2 mugs, set one on the corner of the workbench. He looked at what she was doing. He looked at the chair, at the slat she'd just finished. At the way the scraper had brought up the grain of the old oak so it caught the light in long warm lines. He said, hearing went well. She said it did. He looked at the chair again. That seat's going to need rush, he said. I know, I ordered it last week. He nodded, picked up his mug. She picked up hers. They stood in the workshop and drank their tea, and didn't say anything else for a while, which was one of the things she had come to value about Ed. He understood that silence was not a gap to fill. Sometimes it was just the right-sized space for what needed to settle. Outside, through the open workshop door, the kitchen garden was dark, but she knew the daffodils were out there, all of them. The full row that had come up in April, longer and thicker than she'd expected from the shoots she'd watched in March. Dorothy had planted them at the right depth, the kind of depth that outlasts neglect. Not planning for next spring. Planning for the springs after that, she said. I found a second letter. Ed turned to look at her. From Dorothy, in the back of the fireproof box. She looked at the chair in her hands, then back at him. She wrote it after the first one. About James calling her. About why she put the house in my name. He was quiet. She knew, Clara said. James described me to her and she decided, before I ever came here, before any of this. She turned the scraper in her hand. She said she hoped I'd find it. Ed was still for a moment. Then he said, did you? She looked at him. Yes, she said. He nodded. Once. Then he looked back at the chair. That seat's going to be beautiful when it's done, he said. And that was it. That was the whole of what needed to be said. Because Ed Sutton understood, the way Dorothy had understood, and the way her father had understood, that the right response to something real is not to explain it, or expand it, or talk it into the ground. The right response is to stand next to it for a moment and then go back to the work. She went back to the work. The rocker was finished 2 days later. She set it in the corner of the workshop and looked at it. White oak, old growth, tight-grained. The replaced rush seat, which she had done herself in a pattern she'd learned from a book in Dorothy's library, and then adjusted because the book was wrong about the corner treatment, and she'd had to work it out by feel. The joints tight, the rock true, and even on a flat floor. The family who had commissioned it came on Saturday morning. A woman about 70 and her daughter, who had driven up from Staunton. The woman sat in the chair in the workshop and set it rocking, and looked out the workshop window at the kitchen garden where the daffodils were going golden in the morning light. She said, "My grandmother had a chair like this." Clara said, "The frame's probably from around the same period. The bones are very old." The woman kept rocking. She didn't say anything else. She just rocked, slow and even, with her hands on the armrests, looking out at the garden. Her daughter looked at Clara and mouthed, "Thank you." After they left, Clara stood in the empty workshop for a moment. The corner where the chair had been was empty now. She would fill it with the next thing, and then the next, and the thing after that. That was how it went. You finished one piece and cleared the space and started again because the work didn't stop, which was not a loss but a gift. She thought about Dorothy at 62, sitting in this workshop, at this bench, looking out this window, making the same calculation Clara was making now. Not can I do this forever, but what is the next right thing and then what comes after? The long patience of it, the satisfaction that doesn't announce itself, just accumulates, the way good work accumulates, the way a house becomes a home, not in one moment but in 6 months of mornings, and the particular way the range sounds when the left burner catches. She untied her apron. She hung it on the hook next to the chisels. She stood in the workshop doorway and looked at the kitchen garden. The daffodils would be done in another week. After them would come whatever else Dorothy had planted in the years. Before the house went dark, waiting under the neglect the way all the good things in this house had waited. The easement in the wall, the letter in the cupboard, the thimble on the hook, the lace of root systems in the kitchen garden soil. 22 years patient, ready to come up the minute someone cleared away enough of what had grown over them. She went back to the kitchen. She put the kettle on. She stood at the stone sink and looked out the window at the goldenrod that still filled most of the garden, and at the daffodil row along the south fence, and at the strip she'd cleared in March that was getting wider every week as she had the time and the energy to clear more. It was not finished. It was not supposed to be finished. She was 26 years old and this house was hers, and it had 22 years of work undone inside it, and another 100 years of life ahead of it. And she had a waiting list of 9 and a lathe that worked, and a set of chisels that had belonged to her father, and a workshop that had been organized by a woman who had worked alone in it for 31 years, and had thought of her before she arrived. She was not starting over. She had been handed the middle of something, and she knew what to do with the middle. Her father had taught her. Dorothy had known he had. James had told her without knowing she was listening. The kettle went. She poured her cup. She took it to the back porch and sat on the steps in the April evening and drank it, and listened to the pines, which made the same sound they'd made the first day she pulled up the gravel drive in her car, with $200 and a set of chisels and a key that almost didn't turn, not restless, just present. A house sound. The sound of something that had been here a long time and intended to stay.